welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is a podcast about writing about minimalism. On today's episode, I am joined by my friend Kyle Chayka. Kyle writes about art, design, technology, media, and the systems that shape culture for all sorts of publications like the New York Times, the New Republic, Vox, The Verge, and many others. This past summer, he wrote quite a bit for the New Yorker's Department of Design column. At the beginning of the year, he released his first book, The Longing for Less, Living with Minimalism, which is this really fascinating meditation on minimalist movements throughout history, from modernist composers to Donald Judd sculptures to Buddhist philosophy. Kyle and I have known each other for years. We've worked on a variety of projects together over the years, but I'm also just generally a fan of his writing and wanted to have him on the show to talk about both the new book and his writing interests generally. We begin this conversation talking about the longing for less and talking about minimalism, especially what it means in the midst of a global pandemic and how his thoughts on minimalism may or may not have changed. We also talk about the relationships between minimalism and graphic design and how ideas around simplicity are often masking complex systems. Then we talk about his writing interests and how, even though he might not identify strictly as a design writer, how so much of his work is really about questioning design. What Kyle's work does, I think, is expose the systems that shape culture, whether those systems are economic, political, technological. Those questions, I think, are always questions of design. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to help see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Kyle Chayka. I'd like to start this conversation talking about your book, which came out in January, which already kind of feels like a lifetime ago. And the book, The Longing for Less, it's about minimalism in a really kind of wide and expansive view. And I read it in quarantine, in the middle of this pandemic. And there was a line in there that I thought was interesting where you say, minimalism seems to follow crisis, which really stuck out to me reading it under this moment. And I'm interested in how, if your thoughts on the book have changed since it's come out and since, you know, the world has basically been turned upside down and we are now in a crisis. Have your own thoughts on minimalism? Are there things that you feel like could have been added to it now? Do you see minimalism as a response to this crisis? Like, where are you now with minimalism and the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I still believe that minimalism follows crisis for sure, like particularly economic crisis. Like in the book, it really tracks with the 2008 financial crisis and various other times in American history where there was like a recession or kind of social upheaval. But I did not really reckon with the idea that we would all be trapped inside of our houses all the time. And like, as I kind of talk about, minimalism is usually predicated on like your ability to find other stuff elsewhere. Like you're relying on delivery food or tech companies or, you know, an Airbnb house or something. So like having a super minimalist home is probably not the ideal situation in quarantine. Though it's like, you know, the minimalist interior decorating is not necessarily austere, but it is like you have a few things that you want to focus on within your space. And like right now, having more stuff seems much more desirable.
Well, and it's something that you write about. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I wasn't actually thinking about it in this context. Is that minimalism historically, and maybe I will ask this question, you can kind of explain what I'm trying to say better than the way I'm asking the question and then expand on it a little bit. But minimalism has been kind of reduced to this idea of less is more, Marie Kondo, you kind of all this stuff, the minimalists, all these blogs and podcasts and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But in your kind of research and thinking about this, talk a lot about minimalism as a result of complexity or
Mm-hmm.
minimalism as a minimalism after uh, maximalism, I guess. Not as in the actual stripping away of things, but as in the, how you deal with that complexity. You know
Yeah,
what
I
I
mean,
mean?
it's the end result of a very complicated process. I think in a lot of the cases that I talk about, is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, minimalism sometimes hides, maybe is a better way, the complexity. It obscures it. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit more, and especially kind of how that relates to, or maybe how that starts to fall apart now?
yeah. I mean, I feel like minimalism does often create kind of a facade, like
Yeah.
the simple aesthetic or the austerity that it is usually connected with is like it comes after a lot of thinking. It comes like
Hmm.
after a lot of material accumulation. Often it's like this decision that you arrive at after you've like exhausted other possibilities. And it also has a way of like, I think particularly now it's become a brand. Like in the 21st century, there's this brand identity of minimalism that has these connotations of like high culture and intelligence and good taste. But this idea that minimalism is essentially simple, like actually ends up obscuring a lot of its history and a lot of like the complexity that it's predicated on. So
Right. And in the book, you use the iPhone kind of as
right.
a prime example of that. But I think the examples you were just using about around, getting your food and groceries delivered and those systems is, even more relevant now.
Right. So it like if you're living in a kind of like minimalist Brooklyn condo apartment right now and you were accustomed to like relying on delivery food or like Amazon to get all of your groceries or whatever, like that seems less sustainable now or like less
Hmm.
like a smart solution.
Hmm.
Um, because we just don't have access to the same things anymore. Or like by using those systems, we end up putting other people at risk during the pandemic.
Right. And sometimes I want to come back to this idea of luxury or kind of,
Mm.
high living. Um, but what was interesting to me about the book, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of how you went about writing it and structuring it, but is that minimalism allows us not to think about those systems.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps now that I'm thinking about it, the biggest change since the book came out and now is that we have to think about those systems. That this is like the praise of the essential worker is in a way
Mm-hmm.
talking about these systems that have allowed us to have minimalism in some way, right?
Yeah. I mean, minimalism like is often connected to me with like automation and technology for some
Mm-hmm.
reason. Like
Mm-hmm.
you want to believe something is simple. You want to believe that, by pushing the button, an Amazon delivery just shows up at your door. And you're kind of encouraged not to think about the human side of it. Just
Right.
like in Philip Johnson's Glass House or something, you're encouraged not to think about plumbing and
Right.
heating. You're
Right.
like encouraged to buy into this illusion. So like the interface of technology is often very minimalist, not just in aesthetics or like superficial appearance, but in like concept that you want to believe that it's as simple as possible, even though it's really not.
Right. Can you talk about? I'm very curious. We talked a couple times as you were writing this book, and I get the sense, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that the book that you ended up writing was not the book that you thought you were going to write going into
Totally.
it. And I'm really interested in that evolution, and also just kind of in how the research changed the book, because the research in this book is really kind of far and wide from um kind of Zen Buddhism to Donald Judd to like minimalist composers to
Mm-hmm.
Marie Kondo and everything today. How did this book evolve kind of through the writing and research process, or how did it kind of go in ways you weren't expecting it to go?
Yeah, I mean, from the It's a really interesting process just because of like the nonfiction book industry. Like
Mm,
you do in nonfiction, you usually write a proposal for your book, and
right.
that's what an editor or publisher buys. So my idea for the book initially was, there's a real absence of histories of minimalism. Like it's not a thing that exists. And so I had the great idea to write a history of minimalism. And then I discovered that the history doesn't exist because it's like very, very hard to define and like
Right.
represent. There
Right.
is no like linear history of minimalism that you can write as you would like a history of World War II or
Hmm.
whatever.
And that's what you
Um,
thought you were going to do? You thought you were going
totally.
to write it? Okay,
I thought it
interesting.
was going to somehow track on a chronological
Mm.
basis, like, one century by the next, this like cultural idea of austerity.
Oh, interesting.
um, and that, yeah, I really found that didn't work. It
Right.
was like hard to define, hard to like put in a line, which I think is right because
Hmm.
minimalism is a diffuse and thematic and abstract idea more so than like a delineated theory or whatever. So I kind of like as I was facing that difficulty, I started to make it more thematic and more like
Mm.
associative and less defined. And I kind of never thought about biography that much before.
Mm.
It just like wasn't a form that I related to. But biography and like telling people's life story became a really good tool for like showing how the idea of minimalism evolved and developed because people like Donald Judd or Agnes Martin or Philip Johnson both like practiced these aesthetics and lived them in various ways.
This might be a really in the weeds question, actually,
No,
but
please.
you know, what I really enjoyed about the book, there were a lot of things I enjoyed about the book, but one thing that surprised me was and I apologize for this word, but the kind of poetry of it. It was
No, that's
very
great.
free associative, and we would go from one thing to the next. I was like, huh, that's so interesting how we kind of moved seamlessly into this other person that I, maybe wouldn't have put together right away. And I'm very curious in kind of how and why you selected the people that you did, and if there are other people and ideas that didn't make it into the book,
Mhm.
because I feel this book could have easily been twice as long. If you wanted to add in all of these people. How did you kind of think about that structure and that these were the people that you were going to kind of profile or use as case studies here?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of evolved to fit the structure that I had defined for myself. I mean, I decided on these four themes of the book, like these core aspects of minimalism that I had come up with, which were reduction, emptiness, silence, and shadow. And they kind of, I mean, those subjects co evolved with the people I wanted to talk about, I guess. And so each of these had a few different like characters associated with it. So reduction was kind of about these lifestyle gurus like Marie
Mm-hmm.
Kondo and the minimalists. And then emptiness was about visual artists who adopted minimalism or like pioneered minimalism. So that was naturally like these artists in Manhattan in the 60s, like
Mm-hmm.
Donald
Mm-hmm.
Judd and Agnes Martin. Um, and silence was about composers and kind of our sensory environment. So it kind of tracks the idea of ambient music from Satie and Brian Eno to like the formal minimalist composers like
Right.
Philip Glass and stuff. And then shadow was this idea to like incorporate the heritage of Japanese Buddhism, which is like a constant reference point for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
minimalist thinking, but I think never really gets the full treatment that it deserves. So it kind of evolved from those ideas, and then I wanted to have a few core characters per chapter, and then I kind of referenced other
Right.
people as needed.
And it's interesting, and I don't mean this conversation will not be a whole conversation just on your writing process, but structurally I was also interested in how you allow connections to happen, but you also let things stay unresolved.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a certain kind of openness to the end. Um,
The endings are the worst part.
I just thought I was not mad about it. I did not think that it didn't resolve or that I wanted an answer, but I thought that was a very particular decision.
Yeah, I mean, so the final chapter is Shadow, and it is about, it's mostly like me going to Japan to do this research. And I think, I also wanted to end on Shadow because it was the most unresolved and kind of the most far-reaching. And I think, just as you can't chart a linear path of minimalism, you can't like have a definitive conclusion that's like, we've come to the end of the book, like here's what minimalism means. So instead it's about like coming up with an evocative scene or like an evocative image to end on. And I think the Japanese rock garden really was central to the book and was like, it's just this precedent of visual and aesthetic and philosophical minimalism in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to kind of find an end in that subject. And my editor, like we put images in the chapter breaks, like one image per chapter break. And then my editor had the idea to put this image of a rock garden, this photo that I had taken in Kyoto, right at the end of the book, which, I think another running theme in the book is that minimalism is actually anti-language. To write a book about it is an absurd act. But maybe like, so the only ending you can come to is an ending that's not in language.
Right.
Which I like as a kind of philosophical joke at my own expense. I always look for like forms that cancel themselves out, I feel like.
We should come back and talk about form a little bit, because I think you've done a lot of kind of experimenting with form too, actually. But I have one other thing I want to talk to you about the book, and kind of, I don't even know, like part of me feels like I don't want to tell you this because I feel like I should just write this. But I come from a graphic design background, and so I was reading the book thinking about the relationship to graphic design, and you don't really talk about graphic design in the book at all, other than minimalist book covers, like what these kind of popular minimalist guides, the aesthetic of those. And maybe either I'm giving away something that I should be writing about, or I'm giving you a pitch for if you decide you still have more to say about minimalism. But I was thinking about the idea of minimalism in graphic design, and it kind of connects to Philip Johnson. It kind of connects to the international style. I think a lot of the ways graphic designers historically have thought about minimalism come out of kind of the theories around architecture. But it becomes really obvious or clear to me in thinking about the idea of white space, and that white space in graphic design is seen as the everything that you want in a piece of graphic design is all about the white space, the amount of white space, and in a way that is absence, like you talk about in the book. But white space, especially in print, is also a luxury. To be able to, thinking about a magazine or a publication or a book, to be able to have pages with a lot of white space literally costs more money. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on, kind of the graphic design angle. I know, you're not a graphic designer.
I wish I knew more about it.
But, in your research and kind of thinking about these ideas, if you have thoughts on that.
Totally. I think it's a really good point that like white space also in graphic design is a signifier of like intelligence and taste and money, kind of, because you can afford to like communicate less on a single page. Or like, obviously we all know that like graphic design communicates through absence, etc. But literally there are fewer words on a page, and that is a luxury. Like the New Yorker page layouts just flashed into my mind, how they're just like wall-to-wall text, and it's like, this is what we value. We value the text. We don't care about your like need for empty space.
Right.
And it's, it must come back to like like Russian constructivism and like the early 20th century in graphic design, that like, you know, text became its own abstract element, and you play with, you know, this like very dynamic arrangement of text on a page. And I think like it communicates similar things as well. Like, so in minimalist art, it links obviously to the white cube
Right.
concept, where
Yeah.
like the white empty white box of the gallery is supposed to like reify the minimalist art object as being worthwhile, and so the like empty white space of the page is also like reifying the text, or like the act of the graphic designer, and kind of enshrining it as aesthetically valuable.
Right.
I would love to, I would love for someone to write the essay called like the white page as an echo of the white cube.
Yeah. There's something there, for sure. And I think I wasn't even thinking about it as actually kind of, I was thinking about it purely aesthetics and economics, but I think there's something about the communication aspect to it too.
Definitely.
There was a project a couple years ago, and I can't remember who it was, and I'll have to find it, and I apologize to whoever it was that I can't remember who did it, where they basically analyzed page layouts of magazines from like, you know, the like magazines that are in the like shopping, the like cashier line, all the way up to kind of high end magazines, and they analyzed the amount of white space and tracked that to how much the magazines cost on the newsstand. And you know, of course it was like exactly the magazines that had more white space, that were more open, that were you know, more quote unquote minimal, cost 2, 3, 4 times the amount as the ones that were
Wow.
just like packed with content.
Well, it's like on the internet too. Like
Yeah.
the if a website has like tons of noise and like chum boxes and bad
Yeah.
banner ads, like that speaks to like a certain lack of quality, or like at least like a hustle to make as much money out of a piece of text or whatever as possible.
Right. And we just think now that when it has all of that stuff, that we don't trust it, that they don't care, you know, that it's harder to read. And again, it comes back to what you were saying earlier, but there's like all these systems behind it, that either are hidden, you know, a website that doesn't have a lot of ads is being paid for in some other way.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like Medium or whatever you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, this connects to kind of what my next question was, or kind of I was interested in how this book kind of fits into your larger kind of writing project or your interest, because this book in a way has kind of like everything that you are interested in is in there. It's like art criticism, it's about kind of like lifestyle culture, it's about luxury, it's kind of a travel log. I
Now that you
you
say
know,
so.
right, isn't it?
Oh, totally. I mean, every book should be everything that a writer is interested in my opinion.
I have two questions kind of related to that may or may not be related. I'm interested in how you think this book fits into, you know, your entire body of work. And then, you know, maybe the sub question, or maybe the more interesting question, is how do you describe your work, or like what is your beat, if you have a beat? How do you kind of describe what your writing interests are?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, I mean, I've had kind of a meandering career as a writer on the internet, I guess. Like I definitely started out in art criticism, like purely in the art world. And then I kind of took a detour into technology and like business writing and just kind of more general feature writing or whatever. And I think in the past like 4 or 5 years, I've found my way back
Mm-hmm.
to art more. And so I tend, like the things that I find most interesting are often about like how we experience
Yeah. Yeah.
aesthetics, and how like the systems that we engage with end up influencing the aesthetics that we
Exactly.
consume or
Exactly.
create. So like in the case of the book, it is about this aesthetic of minimalism that's not just art or design, but this like all-encompassing idea. Like I think by aesthetics, I mean all of these things, like a kind of formal like a formal first way of thinking about things or something. Like, I don't mean just visually or conceptually, but in this kind of like holistic way. But yeah, like my stuff, I feel like my stuff is always grounded in like visual experience in some way, or that's what I find the most like direct of a connection in.
In preparing for this conversation, in reading the book, I like to think of myself as somewhat of a Kyle Chayka completist. I think I've read almost everything you've written. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, really the theme of almost all of your work, and I think this even goes back to kind of like the business stuff that you were talking about and the technology stuff, is I think you are interested in, and you started to kind of say this a little bit, in how systems, whether that's capitalism, algorithms, technology, media, shape our ideas of taste, of luxury, of aesthetics, of culture. You might come to it from a kind of visual, you might present it as a kind of visual question, but you're actually interested in the systems behind it, which is exactly what you were talking about with the minimalism book too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, like, I don't know, over time I find myself like distrusting the kind of auteur theory of art and culture, and more thinking about like how particular modes of taste or aesthetics get created and like reified or like, put into place. So why is it that like mid-century modernism was like came about when it did, and why is it so popular now or something? And like right now particularly, we experience so much of culture through technology, and like I think we don't think enough about how those technological systems like actually do shape what we desire and find appealing.
I'm interested, so I kind of have this like theory or argument or kind of idea. Perhaps this is me being a designer and kind of projecting design onto everything, but I kind of see all cultural criticism as design criticism. And especially in talking about these systems, I see that as design questions. And you
Totally.
have been writing recently for the New Yorker, their Department of Design column. And I'm interested in your relationship to that word design. And if you think of your writing as a type of design writing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it all depends on what you mean by design. Like, so if we're talking about design, so it's a good question. Like, to me, design is kind of like applied aesthetics. Like, it's not, design is art and aesthetics like found in mass produced culture often, or like things that are experienced by more than one person at a time. So if we're making it distinct from art, and I'm like completely bullshitting here,
Yeah,
but
no, go
like
for it.
art, like if art is the auteur theory is about the single object and the single experience, then like design is about scaling that up and replicating it and like making it more expansive. And like I think art often moves down into design and like expands into design. But yeah, in that sense, like a lot of what I write about is design, because design is the experience of aesthetics and of aesthetic choices. And we talk about the design of technological systems. We talk about the design of interfaces, just as we talk about the design of a building or the design of a product. Like we all experience design so much on Instagram or on TikTok or whatever.
I mean, I think you're right, and I think the way I've started to think about design in the last couple of years, and this is I've said this before on the podcast, and it feels a bit grandiose every time I say it, but I think of design really at the base level as ideologies made artifact, in that it is taking, it's the systems that that we keep talking about. It's taking points of view, ways of seeing the world, and turning and actually then shaping the world in that image. And so a building is not just an isolated object, or is not just some neutral space that then is filled, but actually has ideas embedded in it about how that building should be used, or where that road goes, or how this product should be seen or how this typeface should be read. And in that sense, I again think that your writing is kind of design writing. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's also about how ideologies become embedded in
Yeah.
aesthetics and in like design choices. So not just talking about design in a vacuum or like visual culture in a vacuum, but trying to understand how all of these things do enact particular regimes of like power or taste or capital.
Right. Right.
And like I'm always interested in how an object shapes its own use or something, or like how a structure how a structure enforces a certain way of using it or experiencing it. So I mean that could be applied to like a
Right.
magazine, for
Right.
example, or
Right.
like a book. Like my book has the structure of the book creates a particular way of experiencing it. And so when you scale that up, like it applies just as well to a technological product or to a building or to a magazine layout, maybe.
Yeah. I this something I was thinking about as I was rereading a bunch of your essays, kind of preparing for this over the last couple weeks or whatever. I was struck by a certain there's like a certain level of like skepticism in your writing that I'm really drawn to, in that I get the sense that you are writing about things that you are not totally sure you buy into. uh, and
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
like the airspace example, I think, is a great example of that. I think your story about Monocle was a great
Mm-hmm.
example of that. And I think like I reread that profile you wrote a couple years ago on Bjarke Ingels, which
Oh
I thought was like
yeah.
very much that. And I want to hear about kind of your kind of critical position and kind of how does it start with something that you're kind of like unsure about, and does in the process of writing does that change? Do you start with something that you're interested in, and then as you kind of deal with it more, you're like,
Fall out of love
yeah,
with
like
it. Yeah.
what does that look like?
Um,
Does it start with the object and then you kind of go to the system to kind of figure out like how do you kind of arrive at that position?
yeah, I feel like it's always the object. Like it's always the thing that I'm attracted to
Mm,
or get obsessed with. So like it starts with, I think most of the things I write about are things that I either do like or once was attracted to, like, or I'm questioning why people are
right. Yeah.
attracted to
Yeah.
them. So like many cases, I start out with something that like seems very compelling or interesting to me, even if it's in a negative way,
Hmm.
like Bjarke Engel's buildings or like Monocle magazine. Like I love Monocle and I still find it completely fascinating. But then as I become more interested in it, I like want to know everything that's behind it and kind of the structure that gave rise to this product, and like the influence that it creates in the world. And so I end up kind of like deconstructing the thing that
Mm,
I
mm.
like until it becomes something that I don't like so much. And like the best things, bear up to that process, right?
Right.
You can deconstruct them to nothing and you still appreciate them.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, deconstruction is a difficult word, but
I know what you mean. Yeah.
I like, yeah, finding the non superficial side of the thing itself. Uh, or like, I did this long feature on tourism in
Yeah. Yeah.
Iceland, and it like ends in a place of total ambivalence of like, is tourism good? Like, who knows? Like,
Right.
do we have authentic experiences? Maybe not.
Right.
Uh, like, I think endings are always. I hate to end on a note of resolution. Like, I think at the end of something, I feel like I would want to make the reader just like end up questioning all of their own assumptions, even about what they just read.
Mm, mm,
like,
mhm.
like if you could come to the end of a piece and be like, wait a second, like maybe it wasn't what I was thinking it was. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
I think like a within the past few months, my girlfriend described described what I do, which is like, um, it was something like, I don't know. We were talking about journalism and how journalism is a lot about like distilling what everyone else
Mm-hmm,
sees and
mm-hmm.
like representing it again. And she was like, no, what you do is figure out something that you see and then make everyone else see it that way.
Oh,
Or like, you know, inculcate everyone else with an awareness of the thing
yeah.
and the way that you're thinking about it. And like I sometimes say that I want to make you like hate the things you like. Like off after a few articles, like people will tweet like I used to like this thing, and now after reading this article, I don't like it. I'm like, that's great, that's awesome. Like, because so often culture is about marketing, and it's about like passively moving you toward consuming something. And if I disrupt that process, then I'm like making you think more about what you're consuming, and that's good.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think I have not thought about your writing that way, but I actually think that is a perfect description of it. Um, I'm I want to go. I'm sorry that I keep like harping on this word design, but I'm
No.
wondering how that you're just talking about. And look, I know you've written for a lot of places. You always are writing for a lot of places, but I find it interesting again that you're kind of working on the New Yorker's Department of Design column, which again is like the first time I feel like you've like really embraced the label design, or that a publication has embraced
Yeah, a
the label
publication
of
has.
design
Yeah,
as what you write about. And uh, Nikhil Saville wrote that column before, who's like my favorite design writer of all time.
yeah, he's
Uh,
amazing. I
yeah,
mean, he's probably doing more good than I am being a socialist
I know.
politician in Philadelphia,
I know. I'm
but
trying to get him on the show.
that's he's amazing. You know, I it's hard to like even exist in the same space because like I'm not quite doing like what was Le Corbusier's influence in Japan or whatever. It's just like it's a level of like rarefiedness that I feel like I don't even understand.
But the question that I'm kind of like thinking about is, I'm interested in that idea of the column or the vertical department of design.
Mm.
And does the New Yorker have things that they are, if you're writing this, are you pitching those? Are there things that are like, this is interesting, but this isn't a Department of Design story? Like it comes back to this definition of design, I guess. I'm kind of interested in how you, and then how a publication like the New Yorker thinks about what falls under that column.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That was a weird way to ask that
Yeah, I mean,
question. Okay.
it's definitely, the other thing is it's like kind of out of my control, but
Right.
the you know there's I think the New Yorker is really good at having, so like the first question is like, what is a column? And a column can be one
Right.
person talking about one thing. Like critics function on
Mm-hmm.
columns. Like you need a consistent space in which to build like a discourse around your own
Mm-hmm.
ideas. But then I also like this idea that a column is just like a recurring space within a publication that covers a subject.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, Department of Design stuff, especially on the internet for the New Yorker, is not like once a week you will review something about
Right.
design or like
Right.
review a thing. It's just like a recurring motif of like, let's talk about design and take it seriously as its own
Mm-hmm.
subject. And so in that way, I think it's like a lot of stuff fits under that label. And a lot of, I mean, for my New Yorker editor, Rachel Ahrens is really great at just like throwing ideas to me and being like, what do you think about
Mm.
this? Like, do you have a way of responding to this? And so a lot of the pieces have come out of that, of her just like emailing me a subject, and then I think it through. But it tends to like expand. Like I try to take the most expansive view of everything that I can. So like the I did this piece on how coronavirus is shaping
Yeah.
architecture for them, and like that's not about reviewing something. It's not about
Right.
talking about a single object or building or whatever. It was about talking to a lot of architects and like seeing how their thinking is changing in this moment.
Yeah. I,
And that's certainly like an element of design. It's just not necessarily resulting in a physical thing yet.
yeah, and I guess maybe the question, a better way to ask the question, or maybe even like a more appropriate way to ask the question, or perhaps a more interesting way to ask the question, even is maybe not necessarily what the New Yorker thinks about a Department of Design story, but do you, if you are writing for that column, or if you are writing under a vertical that even we can generalize it, that just is, this is a design story, do you think about it differently? Do you approach it differently? Or do these ideas that you're kind of always thinking about kind of naturally flow into design stories
Mm.
at times? Or do you change your angle or position or kind of process at all when it becomes a design story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for me, my writing is kind of separated into like, I don't know, you could call it like articles. There are like articles and essays and
Yeah,
features.
yeah, yeah.
And so like an essay to me is like, I guess I think more in terms of formats than subjects
Mm.
for my own
Oh,
writing.
interesting.
So like a feature, like my ideal pieces are mostly features, which means to me that like I go somewhere or experience something and I talk to people and I do this kind of critical writing.
Mm. Hmm.
Like a feature to me like encompasses all of those things and it's usually very
Right.
long.
Right. Right.
Whereas an essay to me is like not taking place within a narrative space and it's more abstract and it's more like theoretical usually and it's not so much reporting. Um, it's more like talking about an idea or whatever. And then these shorter pieces are like, they're I
Yeah,
don't even
I know what you mean.
like they're
Yeah.
pieces of criticism, but they're not to me like the core product of my work is like the large feature of the
Right.
essay, like this kind of larger scale piece of work. And so that would be something more like the architecture piece for the New Yorker, like the Iceland feature for Vox, or like even the Welcome to Airspace thing for The Verge. Like, so when I tend to think in those formats more so than like what is a design story, because I do think to me essentially everything is a design story. Like
Yeah.
there's design is like
Yeah.
a conceptual framework for basically everything that I write about.
Exactly. But yeah, that's
Um,
exactly that's kind of like the core of what I wanted to talk about. What I kind of
yeah,
wanted
yeah,
to like kind of hear how you kind of thought about. Um,
yeah. Though I wish I'm not that well educated in design, honestly. Like I don't have a background of like design theory or whatever. I just kind of pick up what I'm interested in. Like to
I think
me,
that's most.
like Walter Benjamin is like a design critic,
Yeah,
and
totally.
like Rem Koolhaas is a design
Yeah.
critic. But you could even say like Rachel Cusk, the novelist, is like a design critic because she's obsessed with like houses
Right.
and
Right.
writing structure.
Right. Right.
Like her writing is designed by other means to
Yeah.
me. So
It's kind of like I was saying earlier. Like everything's just kind of a design is about design.
oh, totally. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I mean, if you're thinking enough about structure and form, you're basically doing design, I think.
yeah, I was actually, it's so funny that you say that and that you used the word structure there, because I was in the middle of a long essay that I was trying to write for somebody, and I just kept like moving paragraphs around because I felt like the structure wasn't right. And I realized
Mm,
that when I'm writing, and you know I I took like writing classes in grad school, but that's kind of the extent of my writing education. I feel very self-taught as a writer. But I was like,
mhm,
oh, my obsession with structure, that's a design thing. That comes from the
mm,
design education of like how these things flow together and how this story connects to this story and the way sentences fit together. I'm thinking about this as a designer, and I just started
yeah.
kind of making that connection in the last couple months.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are writers who don't think about writing in a design way. Like there are people who just like, write straight through a thing, and then they like kind of figure out a structure after the fact. But to me, it's always like, I mean, when I'm writing a feature, I like label all the sections very
Right.
heavily. Like there's the set out structure before I feel my way through the writing. Or like for the book, like for better or worse, I decided that there would be 4 chapters of 8 sections, like way before I wrote the whole thing. I was like,
that's
this will
interesting.
work. This framework will work
Yeah.
for the writing. And then I kind of work to execute the structure, but then the structure also responds to the content. But there's always like, when you're talking about, everyone has a balance between form and content, and like mine is way on the form side.
That's interesting. You mentioned, feeling like you're not very educated in design, and you kind of got your start as an art critic writing about art. You've mentioned you feel like you're kind of moving back to that a little bit. I think The Longing for Less is very much a book about art in a lot of ways. I'm interested in how your background as an art critic and thinking about art kind of has that at all shaped how you write about these other things? Or is there anything from that kind of that background that you feel like you're still thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, like art writing to me there's like 2 core problems of art writing. And the 2 parts of art writing are like ekphrasis, which is like the description of the
Mm-hmm.
object. And then there's like the providing the context.
Right.
So like writing about art, you have to evoke the thing itself in as best a way as possible. And you have to like create a context for that thing by giving people ancillary information. But like that problem of ekphrasis has always been like one of the most interesting to me in writing. Like how do you describe a thing that is not language in language?
Right.
Like that's such a core question of
Yeah.
writing. Like, so to me, that problem extends throughout all of my writing, whatever it's about, which is like, first and foremost, I need to like figure out a way to really evoke and describe the thing that I'm talking about within the space of the piece, as if there were no other materials. Like in the book, like the images are not there to illustrate what I'm talking about. I instead have to like evoke what I'm talking about in words.
Right.
And so that to me is equally a problem with like the experience of technology or the experience of architecture or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I've always thought about, that's always like my writing is not narrative.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm a good narrative writer, and it's certainly not my first inclination. So rather than narrative, I describe. Like I describe systems, I describe objects, and try to create a momentum through that. Like there was a really good quote in an interview or a book review, or no, this profile of Sarah Schulman, I think, which was like, she describes nonfiction books as the story of ideas. And I think that's like super right
Yeah.
on. Because like I'm not a true crime writer. Like I'm not if I'm trying to create suspense, it's like the suspense of not understanding where like a cultural idea comes from. And I like
Yeah.
that. Like I like the kind of noir critical theory mode.
Yeah.
But that's certainly not to everyone's taste.
Speaking of that, and kind of heading into my final 2 questions, you've spent years thinking about minimalism and thinking about this book. You're always kind of writing a handful of things for a variety of publications. What are you thinking about now, or kind of like what's next? Do you have other book ideas? Kind of where are your kind of critical interests right now, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer that in 2 ways. I'm working on another book proposal, and that will be about like the culture of technology and like how algorithmic platforms shape culture
nice.
as it exists
Nice.
now. So that's again the like systems question, but it's a much more like everyone is consuming and creating stuff through these platforms now of like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. So my question with the book is like, how have these systems shaped the culture that we kind of take for granted now? Like outside of how are we moving beyond human taste and human gatekeepers, and what does that mean? And so that's like, in some ways, I think all my work builds on itself, hopefully. But like, if the minimalism book is like, where did the idea of minimalism come from? This is kind of about like, why is minimalism so popular in digital space, and why does it work, or why did it become the style of a particular moment? So I think that's like good. And I've just been thinking about how like when I was writing the minimalism book, I was like incredibly obsessed with Heian era Japan and like the Pillow Book and like all of these things. And like I was kind of like, oh, will I ever be interested in anything again? But lately I've gotten really, really into Alex Katz's paintings. And so and I've been like drawing a lot more, which I did in like high school and college, but not lately. So that's the thing. Like I always proceed from obsession with whatever. So I feel like in some way I'll end up breaking that stuff down in writing also.
Yeah. I think the kind of algorithm kind of platform aesthetics thing totally. I mean, you've written about that too before, with like the Amazon thing.
Like taste and
so I'm excited. That sounds great. My last question, and this is a question I used to end all these conversations, I want to know what you're reading right now.
That's a great question. Nothing.
Really? I do not believe that.
No, I'm reading. I like never really got the point of art books necessarily before, but I just got this giant book of Alex Katz's paintings, and like these are images that you like can't find online, or if you can find them online, they're not high quality. So having the book is amazing because I can just like go look at the images whenever I want to, and I find that super inspiring and nice. So that book is like, it has this very long essay on Alex Katz's career and all these interviews with him. And then I've also been reading Mary Beard's book on Pompeii, which is very interesting. And like, now that I think about it, it's also about like how we evoke the culture of a time or place based on like the stuff that got left behind. So it kind of fits in a weird way, like Mary Beard proceeding through like wall graffiti and like jewelry and architecture, trying to, show how these people lived.
Are you able to read for pleasure, or like is all your reading somehow feeding into? I know I said that previous question was the last question, but
no. I mean, I kind of only read for pleasure.
Okay.
Like, I mean, there's like assignments that I have, obviously, but reading for research is not my strong suit unless I'm really interested in it. So like, I need to. That's also just not where I'm at right now. Like, I'm not on a big project that requires a lot of reading yet. So those are just like my whims right now.
Yeah, nice. I love that. Kyle, this was so interesting to me. I loved the book. I obviously am a fan.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad we could talk about it. And obviously we've I'm grateful to have had you talking to me about it, and like having done this study hall website project. I feel like we all have to be like commissioners of culture also. I think that's another big thesis of mine. Is that we need to like work on stuff with other people and like participate.
Totally. And I feel like these are questions, like everything we talked about are things that we've talked around in our just kind of casual conversations, and it was really nice to just take this hour and just deal with all the deep questions for once. And so I enjoyed this. Thanks for being on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
This episode was recorded on August 6th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.